Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 177th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. We've had two great kickoff episodes for 2023. The first one with Kalaria and the second was Dan Ram. Now we have a mini-series on poverty and mental health for the rest of January. And is this your first show that you're listening to, or are you a regular listener? Please feel free to leave me a review if you enjoyed the show, wherever you listen to your podcast from. So I've decided to talk about poverty and mental health quite deliberately. I wanted to explore this topic in greater detail, given that so many people are struggling globally and systems are truly failing people. In the UK, we have strikes, increasing levels of in-work poverty, and households with 2 working adults using food banks. This is unacceptable. Needless to say, this has a detrimental toll on mental health. So firstly, let's define the word poverty, because there are a number of definitions out there. And the first one I want to share with you is from the charity World Vision. They say essentially poverty refers to lacking enough resources to provide the necessities of life: food, clean water, shelter, and clothing. But in today's world, that can be extended to include access to healthcare, education, and even transportation. Now, the second definition I'm going to share with you is from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who do an enormous amount of work on poverty and inequity in the UK. And they say poverty affects millions of people in the UK. Poverty means not being able to heat your home, pay your rent, or buy the essentials for your children. It means waking up every day facing insecurity, uncertainty, and impossible decisions about money. It means facing marginalization and even discrimination because of your financial circumstances. The constant stress it causes can lead to problems that deprive people of the chance to play a full part in society. And thirdly, I'm going to share a definition from poverty.ac.uk from 2016 that cites: the key UK government measures take 60% of median income as the poverty line. But while this is easy to measure and does provide useful comparisons over time, it is essentially an arbitrary definition and has been much criticised. The alternative approach to defining poverty is to look at direct measures of deprivation rather than using income as a proxy for poverty. And of course, if you look at deprivation, you're also going to take into account small income and what you don't have access to. And they go on to say, looking at deprivation allows a wide range of aspects of living standards to be included. And Peter Townsend, in his pioneering Poverty in the United Kingdom, argued that deprivation should not be seen only in terms of material deprivation, but also in the social exclusion from the ordinary patterns, customs, and activities of society. So we've got a broad perspective. And personally, I think, yes, we have to look at income, money, services, accessibility, usability, that really broad definition. And it's also useful to consider this idea of absolute and relative poverty, which I was reading more about as I was researching for the show. And I'm going to go back to World Vision again. And where I quote things, I have included links in the show notes if you want to know more. And World Vision talks about the fact that absolute poverty, these are widely talked about. If you type in absolute poverty versus relative poverty, you'll find lots of information about this. But they talk about absolute poverty refers to people whose incomes fall below a line set by a given country. Below this line, people are unable to meet their basic needs for food, water, and shelter. They also have no access to social services such as healthcare, education, and utilities. And this is so vital because we're talking a lot about this now in the UK. And then relative poverty. So I think that we have seen a shift personally from relative poverty potentially to absolute poverty for many people in the UK. But relative poverty refers to people whose total incomes are less than a certain percentage, typically 50% of the country's median income. And because the median income can vary as a result of economic growth, the line for relative poverty can change. And I think the challenge we have there is we've got such a wide gap. So taking the median, how helpful is that in some senses? Because we've got this huge gap, where we're talking about poverty, I've also read reports, and I'm sure you might have too, that luxury goods brands have made billions and billions of pounds, euros, dollars over the last 2 years with a pandemic, because luxury goods have been on the increase. So it is interesting. But when poverty is defined to include access to services and security critical to well-being and not just income and consumption, the global poverty rate increases by 50%. And I think that's tragic, but I also think you have to look at those measures. So this idea of poverty extends beyond money, because we often think poor people equals no money. And of course, that's part of it, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So there is something that the UN have developed called the Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index and the Human Development Index. And the MPI is supported by the United Nations Development Programme because it looks at poverty across 3 dimensions: health, education, and standard of living. So the 10 indicators in this are nutrition, child mortality, which has seen an increase in the UK, tragically, years of schooling, school attendance, cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, electricity, housing, and assets. And I think we could also talk about, the actual costs as well as access. So how is poverty measured in the UK? Well, there's no single best measure of poverty. And going back to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, they talk about the fact that it's a very complex problem that needs a range of measures to tell us different things. And they've actually launched a comprehensive strategy to solve poverty for all ages and places in the UK. And I've included a link to that in the show notes if you want to know more. Now, we think about in-work poverty and the role of the workplace. In the latest CIPD Reward Management Survey, now CIPD stands for Chartered Institute for Professional Development, and they have a number of surveys and research that they do. But the last CIPD Reward Management Survey in April 2022, so quite recent, found that 68% of employers think that financial well-being of their employees has gotten worse since the start of the pandemic and the associated economic lockdowns. And of course, that makes complete sense. And a recent webinar they held also highlighted research showing that between April and September 2020, far more employees reported that their financial security had deteriorated, so that's 35%, than those that said it had improved, 14%. And those people who are on furlough and those experiencing a change in caring responsibilities were 52% and 44% more likely to report a worsening of their financial situations. And then research from the Trade Unions Congress showed almost 2 in 5 workers said that their household suffered a reduction in disposable income since the start of the crisis, while an LCP report found that almost 2 in 5 employees stated that the pandemic had a negative impact on their personal finances. So we know that poor financial well-being will influence the ability of employees to do their jobs. If you think about the stress, if you think about trying to hold all of that, maybe you can't sleep, so you've got tiredness, lack of sleep, not being able to concentrate at work, it's going to have huge impacts. And in financial terms, another study calculated that the annual costs, and here we go with the presenteeism and absenteeism stats, due to poor financial well-being could be as high as 1.56 billion. And also, maybe you're thinking, well, people could just get a better job. Actually, 5 out of 6 low-paid workers fail to escape low pay after 10 years. So it's that whole idea of the system. Once you're trapped in it, if you don't get progression, if you don't get opportunities, how do you work your way out of that? But also, we need to be having systems that enable people and don't keep putting barriers in their way. So it's simply unsustainable to run any business, organization, public sector service on this high level of employee stress as a result of poor financial well-being. And of course, that results in turnover, absenteeism, poor employee morale, and then can often lead to and will lead to poor customer client satisfaction as well. And interestingly, in October 2022, for World Mental Health Day, there was a new briefing that the government issued using the Social Metrics Commission's poverty framework to investigate the connection between poverty and poor mental health in the UK. And the link is in the show notes. And it found that those who experience poor mental health are more likely to be in poverty. And similarly, those in poverty are more likely to report mental health problems than those above the poverty line. And remember, we know there are caveats with that. Poverty is more, as we talked about, than the money, than income. But if we think about poverty holistically, and if you want to know how they calculated that, do check out the report and the briefing. That the link is in the show notes. And in the 2021 Legatum Institute Prosperity Index, the UK ranked 71st in mental health. So this was behind what's thought to be comparable countries like Germany, that was 47th, Denmark 35th, but ahead of the United States at 135 and France at 84, which did surprise me actually. United States doesn't surprise me. And I think if we constantly look at their systems and how corporations prop up what should be a public sector, yes, it's thought to be one of the most unhappy countries, not necessarily according to the happiness index, but reports that you read and things. So we're not doing very well, are we? And of course, there's significant regional variation in mental health outcomes in the UK. So for example, in Blackpool, which is an area of coastal deprivation, and longevity or age expectancies are very low in Blackpool, actually, particularly for men, the depression prevalence is almost 20%, while in Edinburgh, the prevalence is less than 6%. And I'm sure some of that has to do with NHS Scotland, a different model to NHS England. And also 28% of those who report poor mental health are in poverty, compared to 16% of those who do not report poor mental health. And 25% of all people in poverty report poor mental health, and this compares to 14% of those above the poverty line. And we also have to think about that point about access to services. Now, employment status, and often when people get ill, employment can be, it's a twofold thing, isn't it? Having a really awful manager and a very awful circumstances around you at work can cause mental ill health. But equally, for many people, if work is an important part of their life, it can help in recovery. So employment status is linked to mental health outcomes, and particularly for men aged 15 to 40, being unemployed for a month or more can be a serious reason for suicide. So with unemployed or economically inactive having higher rates, and they have people who are unemployed have higher rates of common mental health problems. And employment, as I said, can be thought of as generally beneficial for mental health, but we have to think about mental health benefits of employment depend on the quality of work, the support that you had. And of course, if people are in low paid, insecure work, this poses huge health risks that can be damaging to mental well-being. And just to give you a little bit more stats, and I have included this in the show notes as well, in August 2021, the charity Mind carried out research on mental health and poverty and found there is still a lot of shame about money and mental health. And I think it is a shameful topic full of stigma. We don't really talk about it. So there's a lot of worry about privacy for people facing poverty, and they worry that they don't deserve support, that they don't think they're going to be taken seriously, that it's shameful, that they're going to be blamed, that they're going to be told it's their fault. And many people feel that mental health is a white middle class conversation they don't have access to. That choice and control in support services is really important. And one of the barriers to reaching out for help was the worry of losing choice and control and being told what to do, and a risk of getting sucked into the system, which is seen so often as well around support needed for elder care or childcare. That the services aren't particularly practical or respectful, and having the money you need to get the support you need is a huge barrier, and that often people running the services talk down to people. And if we think about biases and we think about perceptions of people, and not really understanding the link between mental health and poverty and taking that seriously, so you feel worse emotionally. And that people facing poverty go outside the system for help, which isn't a surprise. So that means friends or family instead, maybe in a similar situation to them, maybe not. But also we know that not all families want to help, so that can be another area. Or services that focus purely on mental health, so not really being able to talk about the poverty side of things. And that talking about feelings works better for people facing poverty rather than being told, it's their fault. We have this idea, if you work hard, you'll be fine. And there's so much more to that. So I really hope you're enjoying this episode so far. And if you're enjoying the content and want to keep up to date with my work, then why not join my bi-monthly newsletter? When you join my mailing list, you'll receive a copy of my ebook, The Mentally Healthy Leading Manager. And the link is bit.ly/MHLMEBKLNK. So what can workplaces do then? Or what should we be doing about tackling in-work poverty and poverty overall? And I think it really needs a multi-pronged approach based on systems and not blaming individuals. Now, of course, there are people that make decisions that potentially don't help their financial well-being, but we have to look at the underlying causes of that, much like we talk about with substance misuse. And it's very complicated. And I think one thing we don't really talk about is emotions and money and the connection between that. And perhaps if you're interested and want to know more, I could create another podcast episode or series around that, because I think, again, that's not something we talk about. But if we think about about this approach of how do we help people out of in-work poverty, and there's lots on social media about actually having a monthly paycheck anymore will just about cover what you need. It doesn't give you any cushion or allow you to save or allow you to really do the things you want to do. So firstly, I'm not going to focus on employers first of all, but my number one thing is the government. Why on earth do we have these ridiculously high energy bills? It doesn't have to be the case. If we look at what Germany's approach, who actually had bought more Russian gas, for example, and we don't. So there's a whole thing within that, and I'm not an expert on it. And if you are an expert and you're listening and you'd like to talk about that, I'd love to hear from you. Affordable housing, solid employment laws, stopping insecure jobs and gig economy. Now, if people want flexible jobs and they want to work on an hourly basis, I respect that, but they shouldn't be doing it in a precarious way where they get no sick pay and they get no benefits. And it needs more regulation, basically. Talking to trades unions, I think that would be really helpful instead of ignoring them and pretending that they don't exist. And of course, in-work benefits. So it's this whole idea about get off benefits and get into work. Well, actually, we need a blended approach. Okay, secondly, workers joining trades unions. Now, I know that if poverty is an issue and there is a fee to pay for trades unions, but there is normally some kind of funds available to shape what happens. I think that's vital. I can understand that this can be the last priority, but actually, being supported, and if people who can afford trades unions are paying into it, it can support the people who can't. Looking at the minimum wage versus the living wage, and there's a great table on the living wage webpage, and I've included the link in the show notes. So minimum wage for anyone 21 or over is £9.18 throughout the UK, set by the government, and that is a legal requirement, versus the enhanced or the proper living wage, which is £10.90 in the UK, but £11.95 in London. And I know London's in the UK, but anywhere outside London, I should have said, for anyone over 18 plus, and that's voluntary, but that is like the minimum enhanced standard. Now, these are for employers. So sorry, we're starting from number 3 is for employers. Now, number 4, how pay rates may be contributing to the in-work poverty. So I think another thing to think about is if you outsource, and roles that are outsourced tend to be facilities roles, catering roles, cleaning roles. And I'm not saying don't outsource. I'm not making a comment on that, but many outsourcing companies aren't as ethical as they could be. And we've seen that. We've seen that with what happened with Carillion, for example. So with a procurement process, there's a real opportunity there to take these tenders to task and to really ask them what their policies and procedures are if you do want to continue to outsource, and ask them about this enhanced real living wage. So this is really, really important. And if pressure is put on outsourcing companies, they're going to have to comply because you can vote with your money. And I think that's really, really important. Now, if you're not outsourcing, look at your pay rates, look at the person who's paid the lowest in terms of their role and the person who's paid the highest, and how you can bump them up. And this will also benefit gender pay gap, disability pay gap, ethnicity pay gap. So we know this, and we know that when we do one thing for maybe a particular reason or group of people, it's going to be beneficial for much more than that. So this is really, really important. And this whole idea of we don't have money, you probably do have money, particularly if you're from a big organization. And this is another thing, when mental health campaigns are talked about, it's generally for people who are middle to senior management plus on computers. Do we think about the other staff who are not desk-based? Okay, fifthly, looking at HR procedures, policies, L&D strategies that look at progression of the lowest paid people. So going back to that idea of, 5 out of 6 people within 10 years will not be able to work themselves out of a low paid job. Well, what is going on there? And how do we need to address the investment gap in terms of their training so lower paid staff can boost their skills? And maybe it's not a skills issue. Maybe it's a stereotyping issue that we don't see the skills people have because we assume, oh, they do X job and X job is low paid. And as that job is low paid, they mustn't have any skills. But what about the conversation around that? And again, we can go back and ask the people that are outsourcing that question as well. And there needs to be more of a partnership approach, as well as progression opportunities for part-time staff. So they may be in low paid roles, they may be in middle paid roles, but what are those progression opportunities? And this idea of, only if you're full-time that you can progress. So that absolutely needs to shift. Flexible contracts with benefits. So that relates to the fact that, some people really like working flexibly. They don't mind ad hoc work, but that does need to be supported. And it's absolutely possible to create flexible contracts with benefits. It used to be the case. So that is a way of supporting people. Seventh is real and tangible benefits. So employee benefits which support lower paid workers to cover higher living costs, such as food, travel, and housing. So this could be loans or potentially grants actually for travel. Working with housing associations to get people affordable housing, anything is possible. Vouchers for food, and not in a patronizing way, not in a stigmatizing way, but vouchers for supermarkets and giving them to staff. Free financial advice and support via, it could be your employee assistance program or specialist counselors available that work on financial support, and make sure this is discreet so staff will access this. So again, we're trying to destigmatize that as much as possible. Ninth is emergency financial support. So have a pot of fund available. Like we used to have as students, the hardship funds, and think about the application process, how you could make it really easy and barrier free for entry for people. There are lots of ways to do that. 10th is training managers to ask the questions sensitively to check staff are okay. So we've done a lot around mental well-being, and it could be that we say, how are you? How's everything? Are there any particular concerns for you at the moment? Now, of course, you need to have a rapport and build that rapport, and thinking about financially, how are you at the moment? And creating a culture where this is okay to ask and people can open up about it. Now, of course, most managers aren't trained financial advisors. And so to have that support and the referral information at their fingertips. So if someone says, actually, I'm struggling, we've got the information there. And it's not about saying, well, have you thought about this? Or, you need to save more, but to say, I'm really sorry to hear that. Absolutely, we want to help you. There's a suite of options available. Would you like me to share that information with you? So it has a different feel to it. And then finally, workplaces lobbying the government and taking part in campaigns. So that could be through your sector leader. I'm thinking about for small businesses, we've got the Federation of Small Businesses, and they're great and they do a lot of lobbying. There's, lots of business organizations, health and safety organizations, you know what I'm talking about. So who's your sector lead and how could you be part of this lobbying? Because I think that's so important. And, especially for small businesses with energy. And if you think about, businesses folding, lobbying is really, really important. So I don't know anyone that solved it. I know that there are some organizations that have done some good things, but clearly more needs to be done. Poverty and in-work poverty are very real. It takes a multi-pronged approach. Employers, as always, have a key role to play, linking certain aspects of people's identities together, as this may create compounding barriers. So anyone living with disability or disabled life is more expensive for disabled people because systems are not created to empower disabled communities across the broad spectrum of disabilities. Also, if people are single parents or people are from global majority backgrounds, there are lots of compounding factors here. And also people's identity and their culture will drive how they want to address any financial difficulties. So that's a very important thing to remember. Destigmatize the conversation. How do we train managers? How do we be okay with asking? So you're not prying, you're saying, is everything okay? Can the workplace do anything? What would help you? But in order to do that, there need to be systems in place. And as organizations, consider all options possible and put people before profits, because we know we have a skill shortage. We're going on and on about it, the great resignation. Well, how can we retain people? I think some of the answers lie in this. So what are your thoughts about in-work poverty and what your workplace could be doing better? I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget, you can leave me an anonymous voice note on SpeakPipe. And the link is speakpipe.com/diverse minds. And let me know if anything I have spoken about has resonated with you. And don't forget, if you enjoyed the show, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And I've included all the link in the show notes. And do join me next time, where I'll be speaking to Jerry Perkins from the USA about social justice in America and her work and poverty and equity. So until next time, everyone, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.